They weren't just horror movies, they were threats. Why did local governments try to ban films that people couldn't stop watching? In the 1970s, a wave of occult horror hit theaters and something strange happened. Officials didn't just warn audiences. They tried to shut these films down completely. This isn't about fiction anymore. It's about fear, control, and stories that got too close to something real. Because one of these films didn't just scare people, it changed them. The Devil's Reign, 1975. It didn't open like a movie. It felt like something you weren't supposed to see. Audiences walked in expecting another occult thriller. But what they got was ritual, decay, and something disturbingly real. The film's atmosphere wasn't just dark, it was suffocating. Entire towns reportedly pushed back against screenings, not because of gore, but because of its ritual authenticity. There were whispers that real occult practices had influenced the production, and that idea alone was enough to make local officials uneasy. Churches spoke out, communities protested. Some screenings were quietly pulled. But what truly unsettled people wasn't the plot, it was the feeling that the film wasn't pretending. That somewhere between the melting faces and whispered chants, it crossed a line. And once you feel that, you don't forget it. The Brotherhood of Satan, 1971. At first, it plays like a mystery. Missing people, a quiet town, something just slightly off. But then the truth begins to surface, and it's not loud, it's controlled, organized, planned. That's what made this film so dangerous. It didn't portray chaos, it portrayed a system, a hidden network operating in plain sight. And that idea hit a nerve. Local councils in some areas didn't see it as entertainment, they saw it as paranoia fuel, something that could make communities distrust themselves. The horror here isn't what jumps out at you. It's what slowly reveals itself. The idea that evil doesn't need to hide in shadows, it can live next door. That subtlety is what made it unsettling. And for some officials, that subtlety was exactly why it shouldn't be shown. The Blood on Satan's Claw, 1971. This wasn't urban horror. There were no cities, no modern fears, just open fields, quiet villages, and something ancient waking up beneath them. That contrast is what disturbed audiences the most. Because nothing about it felt safe. The film suggests that evil doesn't arrive, it's already there, buried under the surface, waiting. Local authorities reacted strongly in certain regions, especially where its blend of youth corruption and pagan imagery hit hardest. It wasn't just the violence, it was the implication. That innocence could rot. That communities could turn inward. That something old could take hold without warning. The film doesn't rush, it spreads, slowly, like a sickness. And by the time you realize what's happening, it's already too late. That creeping dread is what made people uncomfortable, and that discomfort is what made it dangerous. The Wicker Man, 1973. There's no monster here, no demon, no possession, just a man, and a place that doesn't follow the rules. That's what made this film so deeply unsettling, because everything looks normal. The sun is shining, people are smiling. But something is wrong, and you can feel it from the beginning. Local pushback wasn't about violence, it was about belief. The film directly challenged religious norms, presenting a world where faith had taken a completely different shape, and that was enough to spark concern. Because this wasn't horror you could dismiss, it felt grounded, possible. The tension builds quietly, almost politely, until it doesn't. And when the truth is finally revealed, it doesn't shock you with noise. It shocks you with certainty. That calm, unwavering belief is what makes it terrifying. And for some, that kind of horror was too real to ignore. The Exorcist, 1973. This is where everything changed. Before this, horror was something you watched. After this, it was something you felt. Reports came in from all over people, fainting, walking out, refusing to finish it. But it wasn't just audiences reacting. Local governments, councils, and authorities began stepping in. Some tried to ban screenings. Others restricted access. Because this wasn't just a film, it became an event, a cultural shockwave. What made it so powerful wasn't just the possession, it was how real it felt. The performances, the details, the way it refused to pull back. It didn't give you distance. It forced you closer. And that closeness is what made it unbearable for some. It didn't feel like fiction anymore. It felt like something that could happen. And when a film crosses that line, it stops being entertainment. It becomes something else entirely. Race with the Devil, 1975. It begins like freedom. Open roads, empty highways, two couples escaping into the unknown. But then they see something they were never meant to witness, and from that moment, the film never lets go. What makes this one so unsettling isn't just the occult element, it's the paranoia that follows. The idea that once you've seen it, you're already part of it. That there's no safe place left. Some local communities reacted strongly to its themes, especially the implication that satanic cults could exist quietly within ordinary society. Not hidden in castles or ancient ruins, but in gas stations, small towns, and roadside stops. That shift from distant horror to everyday threat made people uncomfortable in a very specific way. The film builds tension through isolation, endless roads that feel like traps, friendly faces that feel like masks, and a constant sense that someone is always watching. It doesn't rely on shock, it relies on inevitability. The feeling that escape isn't just difficult, it's impossible. And by the time the film reaches its final moments, it doesn't offer relief. It offers confirmation that what you feared was real, and it was always closer than you thought. For some viewers, and even local officials, that idea was enough to make this film feel less like entertainment and more like a warning. The Mephisto Waltz, 1971. It doesn't scream, it whispers. And that's what makes it dangerous. Unlike louder horror films of the decade, this one moves slowly, deliberately slipping into your mind rather than attacking it. The story revolves around identity, possession, and something far more disturbing. The idea that you can lose yourself without even realizing it. That your thoughts, your desires, might not be your own anymore. For certain communities and local authorities, it wasn't the visuals that raised concern, it was the concept. Because this wasn't about demons jumping out of shadows. It was about control, about influence, about transformation that happens quietly, almost elegantly. The film's connection to occult philosophy and its use of ritualistic undertones gave it an authenticity that some found deeply unsettling. It didn't exaggerate, it suggested. And suggestion can be more powerful than anything explicit. What makes it linger is its calmness, the absence of chaos. Everything feels composed, intentional, as if the horror is unfolding exactly as planned. That control becomes suffocating, because it removes the idea of chance. There's no randomness here, only design. And that design leads somewhere irreversible. By the end, the question isn't what happened, it's when it started, and whether it could happen again without anyone noticing. Season of the Witch, 1972. This one doesn't look like a horror film at first. It feels domestic, personal, almost quiet. But beneath that surface is something far more unsettling, a slow descent into obsession, identity loss, and the seductive pull of the occult. What made this film controversial in certain areas wasn't just its themes, it was who it focused on. Not victims, not outsiders, but ordinary people, especially women, exploring power in ways that challenged traditional expectations of the time. That alone was enough to spark discomfort in more conservative communities. The horror here isn't external, it's internal. It grows from dissatisfaction, from curiosity, from a desire to change something that feels broken. And the film doesn't judge that desire, it follows it, closely, uncomfortably. Rituals aren't portrayed as distant or forbidden, they're accessible, personal. And that accessibility is what made it feel dangerous, because it suggests that transformation doesn't require permission, it only requires intent. The pacing is deliberate, almost hypnotic, pulling you deeper into a mindset rather than a storyline. and by the time the consequences begin to surface, it's already too late to separate choice from influence. For some viewers and local authorities, that blurred line was exactly the problem, because it made the film feel less like fiction and more like possibility. Lisa and the Devil, 1973. Nothing in this film feels stable. Not time, not reality, not even identity. It unfolds like a dream you can't wake up from, fragmented, disorienting, and quietly disturbing. What made it controversial wasn't a single moment, it was the entire experience. The film refuses to explain itself, forcing viewers to sit inside confusion and discomfort. For local authorities and censors, that ambiguity became a problem. Because when a film doesn't clearly separate good from evil, reality from illusion, it becomes unpredictable. And unpredictability is hard to control. The presence of the devil isn't loud or theatrical, it's subtle, almost casual, which makes it even more unsettling. Because it suggests that evil doesn't need to announce itself, it can simply exist, observing, guiding, influencing, without being seen. The film's imagery, strange mannequins, looping events, distorted interactions, creates a sense of being trapped in something that doesn't follow rules, and that lack of structure becomes suffocating. You're not watching a story, you're experiencing a breakdown of logic, of control, of certainty. By the end, there's no resolution, no clarity, just the lingering sense that something has shifted and you don't fully understand how. For some, that was artistic. For others, especially local officials, it was deeply unsettling, because it left too much open and too much unexplained. The Omen, 1976. It looks polished, controlled, almost elegant. But beneath that surface is something deeply disturbing, the idea that evil doesn't arrive with chaos. It arrives with structure, with order, with purpose. This film didn't just scare audiences, it unsettled belief systems, because it took one of the most feared concepts, the Antichrist, and placed it inside a world that felt completely real. Government officials, diplomats, families, everyday life. That grounding is what gave it power, and what triggered backlash in certain regions and communities. The film doesn't rush, it builds, slowly revealing signs, patterns, inevitabilities. And each moment feels less like coincidence and more like confirmation that everything is unfolding exactly as it should, that nothing can stop it. What makes it especially effective is its restraint. It doesn't rely on constant horror. It uses silence, suggestion, and timing, allowing tension to build until it becomes unbearable. And when the truth finally reveals itself, it doesn't shock, it settles in, quietly, permanently. For some viewers, it challenged faith. For others, it reinforced fear. But for local authorities and community leaders, the concern was different. It wasn't just about what the film showed, it was about what it implied. That evil could exist within systems we trust. And that, once it's there, it doesn't need to hide. Mark of the Devil, 1970. Before the film even begins, there's a warning. Not subtle, not implied, direct, almost confrontational. Audiences were handed vomit bags as a marketing gimmick, but for many, it didn't feel like a joke. It felt like preparation. What followed wasn't just horror, it was endurance. A relentless depiction of torture, religious extremism, and moral collapse that blurred the line between fiction and historical brutality. Local councils in multiple regions reacted strongly, some refusing to grant screening certificates altogether. Because this wasn't just violent, it was uncomfortable in a way that lingered. The film forces you to confront something darker than monsters. The idea that cruelty can be justified, organized, even normalized under authority. And that idea hit harder than any visual. There's no escape from it, no relief. Every scene feels deliberate, designed to push boundaries further than audiences were used to. But what made it truly controversial wasn't just what it showed, it was what it suggested. That horror doesn't come from the supernatural. It comes from belief twisted into power. And once that power is accepted, it becomes unstoppable. That realization is what turned this film from shocking into something that felt dangerous. To the Devil, a Daughter, 1976. It begins quietly, almost restrained. But there's something beneath the surface, something controlled, intentional, waiting. As the story unfolds, that restraint starts to crack, revealing a world shaped by ritual, manipulation, and a sense of inevitability that never loosens its grip. What made this film controversial in certain areas wasn't just its content, it was its tone. Cold, focused, unapologetic. The occult elements aren't exaggerated, they're grounded, treated with a seriousness that made some local authorities uneasy. Because this wasn't fantasy, it felt structured, almost procedural. The idea that dark forces could operate through discipline, through belief, through planning, that's what gave it weight. The film builds tension not through chaos, but through control. Every scene feels like part of something larger, something already set in motion long before the audience arrived. And that creates a different kind of fear, not of what might happen, but of what will happen. There's a sense that the outcome is already decided, that resistance is temporary at best. And by the time the final moments arrive, the film doesn't offer resolution, it offers consequence. For some viewers, that was compelling. For others, especially local officials, it crossed a line. Because it didn't just depict evil, it gave it structure. And structure makes it feel real. Alucarda, 1977. There's no slow build here, no gentle descent. This film erupts almost immediately into chaos, intensity, and something that feels completely unrestrained. Set within the rigid walls of a convent, it takes the idea of faith and pushes it to its breaking point, then keeps going. What made it so controversial wasn't just the possession or the imagery, it was the collision of sacred and profane presented without hesitation or distance. Local reactions in some regions were swift and severe, with screenings restricted or heavily criticized due to its raw depiction of religious themes twisted into something almost unrecognizable. The performances don't feel controlled, they feel volatile, unpredictable, as if the film itself is barely holding together. That instability becomes its defining feature. You're not watching events unfold, you're witnessing them spiral. And there's no sense of safety, no moment where things pull back or reset. Everything escalates. Emotion, violence, intensity, until it becomes overwhelming. That's what made it difficult for some audiences to process. Because it doesn't guide you, it confronts you, directly, relentlessly. And by the end, it leaves behind more than shock. It leaves confusion, discomfort, and a lingering sense that something has been pushed too far. For local authorities, that lack of restraint wasn't just artistic, it was a problem. Suspiria, 1977. It doesn't feel like reality. From the moment it begins, everything is heightened colors, too vivid, sounds too sharp, movements too precise. It creates a world that feels artificial, almost dreamlike, but never safe. Beneath that stylized surface is something deeply unsettling. A hidden structure of control, manipulation, and ancient power operating in silence. What made this film controversial in certain regions wasn't just its violence, it was its intensity. The way it overwhelms the senses, refusing to give the audience a stable point to hold on to. Some local authorities and community groups reacted to its graphic sequences and occult themes with concern, pushing for cuts or restrictions. But the real discomfort comes from its atmosphere. The feeling that everything is connected, that every detail, every sound, every color is part of something larger and more controlled than it appears. The horror isn't random, it's designed. And that design becomes suffocating, because it removes unpredictability. It replaces it with inevitability. The characters don't stumble into danger, they are guided toward it, quietly, precisely. And as the truth begins to reveal itself, the film doesn't shift tone, it deepens it, pulling you further into a world where logic no longer applies and escape doesn't feel possible. For some viewers, it was mesmerizing. For others, especially local officials, it was overwhelming. Because it didn't just tell a story, it created an experience that was hard to step away from. The Devils, 1971. This wasn't just controversial, it was confrontational. From the moment it begins, it challenges authority, belief, and the structures that people rely on to feel secure. And it doesn't do it subtly. It pushes forward with a level of intensity that feels deliberate, almost defiant. Local authorities in multiple regions responded strongly, with bans, cuts, and restrictions that lasted for years. Not because the film was confusing, but because it was clear, too clear. It depicts a world where power, religion, and control intersect in ways that feel uncomfortably plausible. And that plausibility is what made it dangerous. There's no distance between the audience and what's happening on screen. No protective layer of fiction. Everything feels immediate, direct. The performances are raw, the imagery is bold, and the themes refuse to soften themselves for comfort. What makes it especially unsettling is its refusal to offer easy answers. It doesn't tell you what to think. It shows you something difficult, then leaves you with it. And that kind of confrontation can be more disturbing than any horror element because it lingers. It forces reflection, and in some cases, it challenges belief systems that people hold tightly. For local governments and authorities, that wasn't just provocative, it was unacceptable. Because once a film starts asking those kinds of questions, it becomes very hard to control what comes next. They tried to silence these films, but they couldn't erase them. Because once something crosses the line between fiction and fear, it doesn't disappear, it spreads. These weren't just stories. They were warnings, obsessions, and for some, experiences they never fully recovered from. And the real question isn't why they were banned. It's why people still feel drawn to them today.